Tonight we begin with chimney sweeping in Victorian England. Not dramatic, not heroic, something ordinary, repeated and slowly normalized. Before continuing, the room can settle. Lights can be lower. A quiet sound is enough. Now we can begin. At the start of the 19th century, coal was burned in almost every room. Coal produced heat. Heat required chimneys. Chimneys required cleaning. This was not occasional work. This was constant work. Soot accumulated quickly in narrow flues. It built up in layers. It hardened against brick. If left too long, it restricted airflow. If left longer, it caught fire. So chimneys were cleaned. They were cleaned regularly. They were cleaned by children. The children were small enough to fit inside the flue, small enough to climb upward in darkness, small enough to be considered suitable. This suitability was not questioned widely. It was observed. It was accepted. It was repeated in thousands of houses across London, across Manchester, across Birmingham, year after year. The children were called climbing boys. Some were as young as 4 years old. Some were 5. Some were 6. They were purchased from workhouses. They were purchased from parents. They were handed over to master sweeps who owned the routes, the tools, the ladders, and the boys. The boys did not attend school. They did not learn to read. They learned to climb. A flue was usually 9 inches wide. Sometimes it was narrower. Sometimes it turned at sharp angles. Sometimes it split into multiple channels. The boy entered from below, from the fireplace, carrying a short brush. The brush was stiff. The bristles were coarse. The boy pushed it upward against the brick and scraped downward, dislodging soot in clumps. The soot fell. It fell onto his face. It fell into his mouth. It fell into his eyes. He could not see. He climbed by feel. His knees pressed against one wall. His elbows pressed against the other. He pushed upward. He scraped. He pushed again. The flue was hot. Even hours after the fire had been extinguished, the brick retained heat. The boy's knees became raw. His elbows became raw. The skin wore away. Beneath the skin, soot entered the tissue. It stained the wounds black. It did not wash out. Over time, the knees and elbows hardened. The skin thickened. This was called seasoning. A seasoned boy could climb faster. A seasoned boy complained less. A seasoned boy was more valuable. The master sweep owned several boys. He woke them before dawn. They walked through the streets carrying brushes, sacks, and scrapers. They knocked on doors. They entered through the servants' entrance. They were led to the fireplace. The boy removed his shirt. Sometimes he removed his trousers. Clothing caught on brick. Clothing slowed the climb. He entered the flue barefoot. His feet gripped the walls. He climbed in silence. Above him, the flue narrowed. Sometimes it turned left. Sometimes it turned right. Sometimes it stopped. If the boy became stuck, the master called up to him. The boy did not answer. The master lit a small fire below. The smoke rose. The heat rose. The boy climbed faster. This was called encouraging the boy. It was not considered cruel. It was considered efficient. The boy reached the top. He pushed his brush through the chimney pot. He cleared the opening. He descended. Soot covered his body. It covered his hair. It covered his face. He coughed. He spat black mucus. He wiped his eyes. He moved to the next house. This continued until evening. At the end of the day, the boys returned to the master's lodging. The lodging was usually a cellar. The cellar was cold. The floor was stone. There were no beds. The boys slept on sacks filled with soot. The soot was sold later. It was used in gardens. It was used in brick making. It had value. The boys did not wash often. Water cost money. Soap cost money. The boys were rinsed occasionally, perhaps once a week, in cold water from a pump. The soot did not come off easily. It stained the skin. It remained under the nails. It remained in the hair. The boys smelled of smoke. They smelled of coal. They smelled of something burnt. This smell did not fade. It was absorbed into their clothing. It was absorbed into their skin. Other children avoided them. Adults avoided them. The boys moved through the city like shadows, visible but separate. Their work was necessary. Their presence was tolerated. Their condition was not discussed. Over months, the boys grew thin. They did not eat well. The master fed them bread. He fed them porridge. He fed them scraps when available. Protein was expensive. Meat was rare. The boys' growth slowed. This was not accidental. A boy who grew too quickly became too large for the flues. A large boy could not work. A large boy was replaced. So the boys remained small. Their bones remained light. Their frames remained narrow. This was managed through routine, through insufficient food, through constant labor, through the logic of the system. The boys did not complain. Complaint was met with violence. The master carried a strap. He used it when a boy refused to climb. He used it when a boy cried. He used it when a boy was slow. The strap left marks. The marks faded. The behavior was corrected. This was understood as discipline. It was understood as training. It was not questioned by those who hired the master. The houses were large. The houses were clean. The chimneys were swept. That was sufficient. Inside the flue, the boy climbed in total darkness. There was no light. There was no air. There was only pressure. The walls pressed inward. The boy's chest pressed against brick. His breathing became shallow. He inhaled soot. The soot entered his lungs. It coated the tissue. It remained there. Over years, the lungs blackened. The cough became constant. The cough became wet. The boy spat thicker mucus. He spat more frequently. He did not recover. There was no recovery. There was only continuation. The work continued. The system continued. The boys continued until they could not. Some boys became stuck. They became wedged in narrow sections. They could not move forward. They could not move backward. They called out. Their voices were muffled by brick. The master could not reach them. Sometimes the wall was broken open. Sometimes the boy was pulled free. Sometimes the boy was not. The body was left. The flue was abandoned. Another flue was used. This happened quietly. It was not recorded widely. It was managed privately. The work resumed. The boys who survived continued climbing. They climbed through winter. Winter was the busiest season. Fires burned constantly. Soot accumulated quickly. The demand for sweeps increased. The boys worked longer hours. They climbed more flues. They earned more for the master. They received the same food. They slept the same way. The cold entered the cellar. The stone floor froze. The boys pressed together for warmth. Their breathing was loud in the dark. Their coughing was constant. No one came to check on them. No one needed to. They woke before dawn. They worked until dusk. They returned. They slept. This repeated. It repeated through the season. It repeated through the year. It repeated through childhood. By the age of 10, a boy's lungs were damaged. By 12, the damage was visible. The boy's chest became hollow. His ribs showed. His breathing was labored. He could not climb as quickly. He could not climb as high. The master noticed. The master replaced him. The boy was sent away. He was not given compensation. He was not given training for other work. He was simply released. He had no family. He had no education. He had no references. He had soot embedded in his skin and a cough that never stopped. He disappeared into the city, into the workhouse, into the streets, into the records that were not kept. The master found another boy. The system did not pause. The chimneys still required cleaning. The work still required small bodies. The need had not changed, so the practice continued. In some houses, the servants heard the boys climbing. They heard scraping. They heard coughing. They heard small voices echoing down. They did not intervene. Intervention was not their role. Their role was to maintain the household. The chimney was part of the household. The sweep was hired. The sweep brought boys. The boys climbed. The chimney was cleaned. The system functioned. That was sufficient. In wealthier homes, the family did not see the boys. The boys entered before the family woke. They left before breakfast. The fireplace was cleaned. The soot was removed. The room smelled of coal, but only faintly. The fire was lit again. The warmth returned. The process was invisible. The cost was invisible. The boys were invisible. They existed in the margins, in the early hours, in the narrow spaces, in the parts of the system that were necessary but not observed. Some reformers began to notice. They wrote pamphlets. They gave speeches. They described the conditions. They described the injuries. They described the deaths. They proposed alternatives. Mechanical brushes, weighted ropes, adult sweeps using ladders. The proposals were considered. They were debated. They were delayed. The delays lasted years. The delays lasted decades. The reasons were practical. Mechanical brushes were expensive. They did not work in angled flues. They required redesigned chimneys. Redesign required construction. Construction required money. Money required justification. The justification was not sufficient. Not yet. So the boys continued climbing. Legislation was introduced. It was introduced in 1800 and something. It restricted the age of climbing boys. It required them to be over 8 years old. It required them to be washed once weekly. It required them to attend church on Sunday. The legislation passed. It was not enforced. There were no inspectors. There were no penalties. The masters ignored it. The work continued as before. The boys were still young. They were still unwashed. They still climbed every day. The law existed. The practice existed. They existed separately. In the flue, nothing had changed. The boy still climbed in darkness. He still scraped soot. He still breathed it in. His knees still bled. His elbows still hardened. His cough still deepened. The system had not adjusted. The system did not need to. The chimneys still burned coal. The coal still produced soot. The soot still required removal. The removal still required small bodies. And small bodies were still available. They were still cheap. They were still replaceable. So the work continued. Slowly, plainly, without urgency. Year after year, the boys developed injuries that were not treated. There were no doctors for climbing boys. Doctors cost money. The boys had no money. The masters had no interest in spending money. A boy with an injury either recovered or he did not. If he recovered, he returned to work. If he did not, he was replaced. This was understood as natural. The body either adapted or it failed. The knee swelled. The skin split open. Beneath the split skin, infection entered. The infection spread slowly. The knee became hot. It became red. It became painful to bend. The boy still climbed. He climbed with the infected knee. He pressed it against brick. The pressure reopened the wound. Soot entered the wound again. The infection worsened. The boy's movements slowed. The master noticed the slowness. He did not notice the infection. He noticed only that the work took longer. He struck the boy. The boy climbed faster. The knee did not heal. Some boys developed sores on their elbows. The sores were deep. They exposed the bone. The bone became visible through the skin. Soot stained the exposed bone black. The boy continued working. He wrapped cloth around the elbow. The cloth fell off inside the flue. He left it there. He climbed without it. The sore widened. It did not close. It became permanent, a feature of the body, a mark of the trade. Other boys developed growths. The growths appeared on the scrotum. They appeared as small lumps. The lumps grew slowly. They became painful. They became ulcerated. They bled. The condition was called soot wart. It was specific to climbing boys. It did not occur in other children. It did not occur in adults. It occurred only in those who spent years climbing through soot while naked from the waist down. The soot contained chemicals. The chemicals irritated the skin. The irritation became chronic. The chronic irritation became mutation. The mutation became cancer. The cancer was not understood as cancer. It was understood as soot wart. It was understood as part of the trade. The boys did not speak of it. The masters did not treat it. The condition progressed. The growths became larger. They became infected. They became agonizing. The boy could not walk properly. He could not climb properly. He was dismissed. He died shortly after. The death was not recorded as occupational. It was recorded as natural decline, as fever, as wasting, as something inevitable. The records did not connect the soot to the wart. They did not connect the wart to the death. The boy was gone. Another boy took his place. The pattern repeated. It repeated in silence. The flues themselves varied. Some were straight. These were easier. The boy climbed directly upward. He reached the top in minutes. He descended quickly. These flues were uncommon. Most flues turned. They turned at sharp angles. They turned without warning. The boy climbed upward. His head struck brick. The flue had turned. He adjusted his body. He twisted. He pushed his shoulders through the turn. His hips followed. The space was tight. The brick scraped his skin. He continued. Another turn appeared. He twisted again. His body became wedged. He could not move forward. He could not move backward. He remained still. He breathed slowly. He tried to shift his weight. The brick pressed into his ribs. He exhaled fully. His chest compressed. He pushed forward. The brick scraped his back. He moved an inch. He inhaled. His chest expanded. The brick stopped him. He exhaled again. He moved another inch. This continued, inch by inch, breath by breath. The boy moved through the turn. He emerged into a wider section. He rested. He coughed. He continued climbing. Some flues contained bends that were horizontal. The boy climbed upward until the flue turned sideways. He could not climb sideways. He had to crawl. He lay on his stomach. He pulled himself forward with his elbows. His face pressed against the brick. The space above his back was inches. He could not lift his head. He could not see. He pulled himself forward in darkness. The soot was thicker here. It had accumulated in the horizontal section. It had compacted. The boy scraped it with his hands. He pushed it forward. It fell into the next vertical section. He crawled after it. His breathing was shallow. There was no air. The air he inhaled was filled with soot. His lungs burned. He did not stop. He could not stop. Behind him, the flue was blocked by his body. There was no room to turn around. There was only forward. He crawled until the flue turned upward again. He climbed. He reached the top. He cleared the chimney pot. He descended. He coughed for an hour afterward. He coughed until he vomited. He vomited black liquid. He wiped his mouth. He moved to the next house. The next house had multiple flues. The house was large. There were 12 fireplaces, 12 chimneys. Some chimneys served 2 rooms. Some served 3. The flues branched inside the walls. They met at a central stack. The boy entered the first flue. He climbed to the branch. He chose the left branch. He climbed to the top. He descended. He entered the same flue again. He climbed to the branch. He chose the right branch. He climbed to the top. He descended. He entered the second flue. He repeated the process. This took hours. The master waited outside. The master smoked a pipe. The master spoke with other tradesmen. The boy worked alone inside the walls. He moved from flue to flue. He did not rest. Rest wasted time. Time cost money. The boy was expected to work quickly. He was expected to work quietly. He was not expected to be seen. The household continued around him. Servants prepared breakfast. They carried trays upstairs. They lit fires in the rooms the boy had just cleaned. The fires burned. The smoke rose. The boy was still inside another flue. He smelled the smoke. It entered from below. It filled the flue. He climbed faster. He reached the top. He emerged into daylight. He stood on the roof. His body was black. His eyes were red. He breathed cold air. He coughed. He looked across the rooftops. Other boys stood on other roofs. They did not wave. They did not speak. They simply stood. Then they descended. The boy climbed back down into the flue. He exited through the fireplace. The room was empty. He walked through the house. He left black footprints on the floor. A servant scrubbed them later. The boy exited through the servant's door. He joined the master. They walked to the next house. In winter, the houses were warm inside. The contrast was sharp. The boy entered from the cold street. He entered the warm house. He stood in front of the fireplace. The heat radiated from the bricks. He felt it on his skin. Then he climbed into the flue. The flue was hotter. The bricks burned his hands. They burned his knees. He climbed quickly to avoid the heat. The quickness made him careless. His foot slipped. He fell. He fell several feet. He caught himself with his elbows. The elbows struck brick. The skin tore. He hung there. He regained his footing. He climbed again. His hands shook. His elbows bled. He reached the top. He descended slowly. When he emerged, his hands were blistered. The blisters were white. They filled with fluid. The fluid leaked. The skin beneath was raw. The boy wrapped his hands in rags. He climbed the next chimney with wrapped hands. The rags became soaked with blood. They became soaked with soot. They stuck to the wounds. When he removed them, the skin came away. He did not wrap them again. He climbed with open wounds. The wounds became infected. The infection caused fever. The fever caused weakness. The boy still climbed. He climbed slower. He climbed with trembling hands. The master watched him. The master said nothing. The boy either recovered or he did not. The boy recovered. The fever passed. The hands healed poorly. The skin was scarred. The scars were thick. The hands were less flexible, but they still functioned. So the boy still functioned. He returned to full work. The system continued. In some chimneys, birds had nested. The nests were built on ledges inside the flue. The nests were made of twigs. They were made of grass. They were made of feathers. The boy climbed into the flue. His hand touched the nest. The nest fell. It fell onto his face. Insects crawled from the nest. They crawled into his hair. They crawled into his ears. He shook his head. He continued climbing. The insects remained. They bit his scalp. He scratched. His nails were broken. They did not reach the insects. He climbed to the top. He descended. The insects stayed in his hair for days. They laid eggs. The eggs hatched. The boy's scalp itched constantly. He scratched until it bled. The bleeding stopped eventually. The insects did not. Other boys had lice. All the boys had lice. Lice were constant. They lived in the hair. They lived in the seams of clothing. They bit the skin. They caused itching. The itching was maddening. The boys scratched. They scratched until they bled. The blood dried. The soot covered it. The lice remained. There was no treatment. There was no washing sufficient to remove them. The boys learned to tolerate the itching. They learned to tolerate the bites. They learned to tolerate discomfort as permanent. Discomfort became normal. Normal became invisible. Invisible became endured. At night, the boys returned to the cellar. The cellar had no windows. It had no ventilation. The air was thick. It smelled of soot. It smelled of sweat. It smelled of infection. The boys lay on sacks. The sacks were thin. The floor was cold beneath them. The cold entered their bodies. They pressed together. 5 boys. 6 boys. Sometimes 7. They shared warmth. They shared lice. They shared illness. When one boy coughed, the others coughed. When one boy fevered, the others fevered. The sickness passed between them. It passed through breath. It passed through touch. It passed through proximity. There was no isolation. There was no space. There was only the cellar, and the sacks, and the bodies pressed together in darkness. The master slept upstairs. He slept in a bed. He slept alone. He did not hear the coughing. He did not smell the cellar. He woke at dawn. He kicked the cellar door. The boys woke. They stood. They dressed. They climbed the stairs. They walked into the cold morning. They began again. The streets were empty before dawn. The city was dark. The boys walked in a line. The master walked ahead. He carried a lantern. The boys carried brushes. Their breath was visible. Their coughing echoed. They did not speak. Speech was not required. They knew the route. They knew the houses. They knew which doors to approach. They stopped at the first house. The master knocked. A servant opened the door. The master entered. The boys entered. They were led to the fireplace. The first boy removed his clothing. He entered the flue. The others waited. They waited in silence. They waited in the cold kitchen. They stood near the fireplace. They did not sit. Sitting was not permitted. They stood until the first boy descended. Then the second boy climbed. Then the third. This continued until all flues were cleaned. Then they moved to the next house. The morning passed. The afternoon passed. The light faded. The boys were still working. They worked until they could no longer see. They worked until the master decided to stop. The master decided based on money. If enough money had been earned, they stopped. If not, they continued. The boys had no say. They simply climbed when told. They stopped when told. They returned when told. At the end of each day, the master counted coins. He counted payment from each house. He calculated profit. He calculated cost. The cost was low. The boys cost almost nothing. Food was minimal. Shelter was a cellar. Clothing was unnecessary. The profit was significant. The master kept the profit. The boys received nothing. They were not employees. They were property. They had been purchased. They would be used until broken, then discarded, then replaced. This was understood. This was normal. This was the structure. The structure did not require justification. It required only continuation. And it continued. Week after week, month after month, season after season. The boys grew older. They grew weaker. They grew sicker. But they did not grow larger. Larger boys could not fit. So the boys remained small, malnourished, stunted, functional. When a boy reached 12 or 13, his usefulness ended. His body had begun to grow despite the hunger. His shoulders widened. His hips widened. He became stuck more frequently. He took longer to complete each climb. The master noticed. The master dismissed him. The boy was sent away with nothing. No payment. No reference. No training. No prospects. He left the master's house. He walked into the city. He had nowhere to go. He had no skills except climbing. Climbing was not a skill outside Chimneys. He had no education. He could not read. He could not write. He could not calculate. He had no family. No connections. No options. He stood on the street. He coughed. His lungs were ruined. His body was scarred. His hands were deformed. His knees were black with embedded soot. He was 13 years old. He looked older. He felt older. He was exhausted. He found work occasionally, carrying loads, sweeping streets. Any labor no one else would do. The work paid little. It paid enough for bread. It did not pay for shelter. He slept in doorways. He slept under bridges. He slept in alleys. The cold entered his lungs. The cough worsened. He coughed blood. The blood was black. He grew thinner. He grew weaker. He stopped finding work. He stopped looking. He sat against a wall. He coughed. He slept. He did not wake. His body was found. It was removed. It was buried without record, without name, without ceremony. The city continued. Another boy was already climbing. The practice did not end quickly. It thinned over decades. New laws were written. The laws were ignored, then written again. Enforcement came slowly. Inspectors were appointed. Fines were issued. Some masters paid the fines. They continued using boys. The fines increased. The masters calculated cost. Eventually, the cost became too high. Mechanical brushes improved. They became cheaper. They became more reliable. Chimneys were redesigned. Flues were widened. Adult sweeps could access them. The need for small bodies decreased. The supply of boys decreased. Workhouses stopped selling children for sweeping. Parishes refused contracts. Public opinion shifted. Not suddenly, not universally, but gradually. The last climbing boys worked into the 1870s. They climbed in rural areas, in towns where enforcement was weak, in houses where tradition persisted. They climbed until they grew too large. Then they stopped. No new boys replaced them. The practice faded, not through dramatic intervention, not through sudden moral awakening, through economic shift, through mechanical advancement, through the quiet replacement of one system with another. The boys who survived carried the marks: blackened knees, scarred elbows, ruined lungs, shortened lives. They died young. Most died before 40. Their deaths were not dramatic. Lung disease, respiratory failure, cancer that had no name yet. They died in workhouses. They died in cheap lodgings. They died alone. Their graves were unmarked. Their names were forgotten. The chimneys remained. The chimneys still stand. Brick structures built in the 1800s. The flues are still narrow. The turns are still sharp. The soot has been cleaned away by machines now, by brushes on rods, by adults who enter from above. by methods that do not require children. The houses are warm, the fires still burn, the system still functions, just differently, quietly, without the small bodies wedged in darkness, without the coughing, without the soot-stained children walking through dawn streets. That part ended. Not suddenly. It thinned. It slowed. What remained was not collapse, but absence. Not noise. Not spectacle. Just the quiet result of things left unchanged for too long. Then changed. Then forgotten. At the start of the 1900s, cotton was processed in large factories. The factories were built of brick. They were built near rivers. They were built in Lancashire, in Manchester, in Bolton, in Oldham. The factories employed thousands. Men operated the heavier machines. Women operated the spinning frames. Children operated the smaller tasks. The work was constant. The machines ran continuously. They ran from dawn until late evening. They ran 6 days each week. The workers moved between the machines. They replaced empty bobbins. They tied broken threads. They cleaned beneath the frames. They did this for 12 hours, sometimes 13, sometimes 14. The length depended on demand. Demand was high. Cotton cloth was needed. It was needed for clothing, for bedding, for export, for profit. The factories produced it efficiently. The efficiency required speed. Speed required noise. The machines clattered. They clattered loudly. The sound filled the room. The room was called the spinning room. The spinning room was vast. It contained hundreds of machines. Each machine had multiple spindles. The spindles turned rapidly. They twisted raw cotton into thread. The thread was wound onto bobbins. The bobbins were replaced when full. This happened constantly. The workers moved along the rows. They moved quickly. They moved without pause. There was no time to pause. The machines did not stop. If a machine stopped, production stopped. If production stopped, wages were reduced. So the machines ran, and the workers moved, and the noise continued. The noise was loud enough to prevent speech. The workers could not hear each other. They communicated through gestures, through nods, through pointing. They learned to read lips. They learned to anticipate problems. A broken thread made a different sound. A jammed bobbin made a different sound. The workers heard these differences. They responded immediately. They moved to the machine. They fixed the problem. They returned to their pattern. The pattern repeated. All day, every day. The cotton itself created dust. The raw cotton arrived in compressed bales. The bales were opened. The cotton was fed into carding machines. The carding machines separated the fibers. They separated them violently. The fibers became airborne. They became dust. The dust was fine. It was so fine it remained suspended. It filled the air. It filled the room. It settled on surfaces. It settled on skin. It entered the nose. It entered the mouth. It entered the lungs. The workers breathed it constantly. There was no ventilation. The windows were kept closed. Closed windows maintained humidity. Humidity prevented thread breakage. Thread breakage reduced production. So the windows remained closed. The air remained still. The dust remained suspended. The workers breathed it in. They breathed it for 12 hours. They breathed it every day. They breathed it for years. The dust was visible. In bright light, it appeared as a haze. The sunlight came through high windows. It illuminated the particles. The particles drifted slowly. They moved in currents created by the machines. They settled on the workers' hair. They settled on their clothing. They settled on their eyelashes. The workers' clothing became white. Not from bleaching, from dust. The dust coated the fabric. It penetrated the weave. It could not be fully removed. The workers washed their clothing weekly. The clothing never became fully clean. It remained grey-white. It remained stiff with embedded dust. The workers wore the same clothing each day. A simple dress for women, a shirt and trousers for men. No protective covering, no masks, no barriers between skin and dust. The dust settled on exposed skin. It settled on arms, on necks, on faces. It mixed with sweat. It formed a paste. The paste dried. It cracked. The workers wiped it away. It reformed. This continued throughout the shift. At the end of the shift, the workers' faces were white. Their hands were white. Their hair was white. They walked home through the streets. They walked in groups. They were identifiable immediately. Mill workers, cotton workers, covered in dust. The dust marked them. It marked their occupation. It marked their class. It marked their future. Inside the mill, the temperature was carefully controlled. The air was kept warm. Warm air held more moisture. Moisture prevented static. Static caused thread breakage, so the air was kept between 70 and 80 degrees. In summer, the temperature was higher. The workers sweated. The sweat soaked their clothing. The clothing stuck to their skin. The dust stuck to the sweat. The combination was uncomfortable. The workers did not complain. Complaint achieved nothing. The temperature was necessary. The system required it. So the workers endured it. They endured the heat. They endured the humidity. They endured the dust. They moved between the machines. They worked rapidly. Their hands moved constantly, tying threads, replacing bobbins, clearing jams. The work required dexterity. It required speed. It required attention. A moment of inattention caused injury. The machines had moving parts, gears, belts, spindles rotating at high speed. The workers reached between these parts. Their hands moved near the mechanisms. Sometimes a sleeve caught. The fabric was pulled into the machine. The arm followed. The machine did not stop. The worker screamed. Other workers heard nothing. The noise was too loud. The overseer noticed eventually. The overseer stopped the machine. The worker's arm was crushed. Sometimes it was mangled. Sometimes it was severed. The worker was taken away. The machine was cleaned. The machine was restarted. Another worker took the position. The pattern continued. The injuries were common. Every mill had injured workers. Some had lost fingers. Some had lost hands. Some had lost arms. They continued working if possible. They worked with their remaining hand. They worked at simpler tasks. They earned reduced wages. If they could not work, they were dismissed. There was no compensation. There was no insurance. There was only dismissal. The worker left. Another worker was hired. Workers were plentiful. Jobs were scarce. The system continued. The dust entered the lungs. The lungs were designed to filter particles. Small particles were trapped in mucus. The mucus was coughed up. The mucus was expelled. But cotton dust was very fine. The finest particles were not caught. They traveled deep into the lungs. They settled in the smallest airways. They remained there. The body tried to remove them. It sent cells to break them down. The cells could not break them down. The cells died trying. More cells arrived. They died also. The tissue became inflamed. The inflammation became chronic. The airways narrowed. Breathing became difficult. This happened slowly, over months, over years. The workers noticed the change. They noticed they tired more easily. They noticed they breathed more heavily. They noticed a cough developing. The cough was dry at first. It became persistent. It occurred throughout the day. It occurred at night. It disrupted sleep. The workers ignored it. Everyone had the cough. Every mill worker coughed. It was normal. It was expected. It was called mill cough. The cough worsened over time. It became productive. The workers coughed up mucus. The mucus was grey, sometimes white, sometimes streaked with brown. They spat it into handkerchiefs. They spat it onto the floor. The floor was already covered in dust. The mucus mixed with the dust. It was swept away at the end of the shift. It accumulated again the next day. The breathing difficulty increased. Workers struggled to walk quickly. They struggled to climb stairs. They struggled to keep pace with the machines. The overseer noticed. The overseer reassigned them. They were moved to slower work. They were moved to cleaning. They were moved to tasks that required less exertion. Their wages were reduced. The breathing continued to worsen. Eventually, they could not work at all. They were dismissed. They returned home. They sat in their houses. They breathed with difficulty. They coughed constantly. The condition was called byssinosis. It was specific to cotton workers. It was understood as inevitable, as part of the trade, as something that happened after enough years. There was no treatment. There was no cure. There was only progression. The workers grew weaker. Their lungs grew stiffer. Their breathing grew shallower. They died quietly, in their homes, in their beds, from respiratory failure, from pneumonia, from heart strain caused by damaged lungs. They died in their 40s, sometimes in their 50s, rarely older. The deaths were not considered unusual. They were expected. They were recorded as natural causes, as lung disease, as chronic bronchitis. The connection to cotton dust was known. It was observed. It was documented in medical journals. It was not addressed. The mills continued operating. The windows remained closed. The dust remained in the air. The workers continued breathing it. The children started young. They started at 12 years old, sometimes younger. They were employed as piecers. Piecers walked beneath the spinning frames. They crawled between the machinery. They tied broken threads. The work required small hands. It required small bodies. Children were ideal. They were paid less than adults. They were easier to replace. They worked the same hours. They breathed the same air. They developed the same cough. By the time they were adults, their lungs were already damaged. They continued working. They worked until they could not. Then they were dismissed. The pattern repeated. Generation after generation, family after family. The same families worked in the same mills. Fathers and sons, mothers and daughters. They entered the mill together. They worked side by side. They developed the same symptoms. They died of the same causes. This was understood as normal, as the way things were, as unavoidable. The mills were profitable. The owners lived elsewhere. They lived in large houses. They lived in clean air. They did not visit the spinning rooms. They received reports. They received production numbers. They received profit calculations. The numbers were satisfactory. The system functioned. The cotton was processed. The cloth was sold. The profit was maintained. The cost was invisible. The cost was measured in lungs, in shortened lives, in quiet deaths, in families that repeated the pattern. The workers knew the risk. They accepted it. They had no alternative. The mills were the only employment. The towns existed because of the mills. Without the mills, there was nothing. So the workers entered. They breathed the dust. They developed the cough. They worked until they could not. Then they left. Then they died. The mills continued. The machines continued. The dust continued. Year after year, decade after decade, improvements came slowly. They came reluctantly. They came through pressure. Trade unions formed. The unions were weak at first. They represented small groups. They demanded shorter hours. They demanded better conditions. They demanded ventilation. The demands were refused. The refusals were consistent. The owners cited cost. They cited competition. They cited economic necessity. The mills could not afford changes. Changes would reduce profit. Reduced profit would cause closures. Closures would eliminate jobs. So nothing changed. The workers continued. The unions grew stronger. Membership increased. Pressure increased. Strikes were threatened. Some strikes occurred. The strikes were brief. The workers could not afford long strikes. They had no savings. They had no reserves. They returned to work. The conditions remained the same. Legislation was proposed. It was proposed in Parliament. It was debated. The debates lasted years. Factory inspectors were mentioned. Ventilation requirements were mentioned. Maximum hours were mentioned. The proposals were amended. They were weakened. They were delayed. Some legislation passed. The legislation required basic ventilation. It required windows to be opened periodically. It required some dust extraction. The requirements were vague. Enforcement was minimal. Inspectors were few. Inspectors gave warnings. The warnings were noted. Minor changes were made. The changes were temporary. After the inspector left, the windows were closed again. The humidity had to be maintained. The production had to continue. So the practices resumed. The dust remained. Medical understanding improved. Doctors studied bicyanosis. They measured lung capacity. They documented progression. They published findings. The findings were clear. Cotton dust caused permanent lung damage. The damage was preventable. Prevention required ventilation. Prevention required dust extraction. Prevention required protective equipment. The findings were acknowledged. They were not implemented. Implementation required investment. Investment reduced profit. The mills declined to invest. The medical evidence accumulated. The workers continued to suffer. Compensation was sought. Workers filed claims. The claims were denied. The connection was disputed. The mills employed doctors. The doctors testified. They testified that bicyanosis was constitutional, that some workers were predisposed, that it was not solely caused by dust. The courts accepted this testimony. The claims were rejected. The workers received nothing. They died without compensation. Their families received nothing. The system protected itself. It protected profit. It protected continuity. It did not protect workers. The First World War arrived. Demand for cotton increased. Uniforms were needed. Bandages were needed. Tents were needed. The mills ran longer hours. They ran 7 days. The workers worked extended shifts. The dust increased. The ventilation decreased. Production was urgent. Health was secondary. The workers coughed more. They weakened faster. They died younger. This was noted. It was accepted as wartime necessity. After the war, the mills reduced hours. They reduced wages. Demand had fallen. Competition from abroad increased. Indian mills produced cheaper cloth. American mills produced faster. The Lancashire mills struggled. They reduced costs. They reduced maintenance. They reduced safety measures. The dust worsened. The machinery aged. The buildings deteriorated. The workers continued inside them. The Great Depression arrived. Mills closed. Thousands of workers were dismissed. The dismissed workers were relieved. They no longer breathed the dust, but they had no income. They had no prospects. They had damaged lungs and no work. Some mills remained open. They operated at reduced capacity. The workers who remained were grateful to still have work, even work that destroyed their lungs, even work that paid barely enough. They had no choice, so they continued. The Second World War arrived. Demand increased again. The mills reopened. The workers returned. They worked long hours again. They breathed the dust again. They coughed again. The pattern repeated. War required production. Production required workers. Workers were expendable. The dust was unavoidable. So it continued. After this war, synthetic fibers appeared. Nylon was developed. Polyester was developed. These fibers did not produce dust. They were processed differently. They required different machinery. Some mills converted. Some mills closed. The cotton mills declined. Employment fell. The buildings were abandoned. The machinery was sold. The workers found other employment. Or they did not. The industry faded. Not through reform. Not through improved conditions. Through obsolescence. Through economic shift. Through replacement. The mills that remained modernized slowly. Ventilation improved. Dust extraction systems were installed. Not from moral concern. From regulation that finally had force. From unions that finally had power. From workers who finally could refuse. By the 1960s, conditions had improved. The air was clearer. The dust was reduced. The cough was less common, but the workers who had spent decades inside still carried the damage. Their lungs were still scarred. Their breathing was still labored. They still died early. The damage was permanent. The exposure had ended, but the consequences remained. The last cotton mills closed in the 1980s. The buildings were converted. Some became museums. Some became apartments. Some were demolished. The machinery was preserved. The spinning frames stand silent now. They are displayed behind glass. They are labeled with descriptions. The descriptions mention the Industrial Revolution. They mention production efficiency. They mention economic growth. They rarely mention the dust. They rarely mention the workers. They rarely mention the cough. The workers are gone now. Those who survived are very old. They still cough. Their lungs still carry the scars. The tissue is still damaged. The damage cannot be reversed. They sit in their homes. They breathe with effort. They remember the noise. They remember the dust. They remember the machines. They do not speak of it often. It was simply work. It was what they did. It was what everyone did. It was normal. The buildings remain. Brick structures built in the 1800s. Built in the early 1900s. The windows are broken now. The floors are empty. The air is still. No dust rises. No machines clatter. No workers move between the rows. That part ended. It did not end suddenly. It thinned. It slowed. Economic forces shifted. Technology changed. The need decreased. The workers aged out. The buildings emptied. What remained was not collapse, but absence. Not noise. Not dust. Just the quiet result of systems that valued production more than breath. Then stopped producing. Then stood empty. Then were forgotten. The compensation came late. It came decades late. In the 1970s, bicyanosis was finally recognized. It was recognized as an occupational disease. Workers could file claims. The claims were processed slowly. Medical evidence was required. Lung function tests were required. Employment records were required. Many workers had no records. The mills had closed. The records were lost. The workers could not prove their employment. They could not prove the duration. They could not prove the exposure. Their claims were denied. Some workers had records. They filed successful claims. They received compensation. The compensation was modest. It was calculated by formula. Years of exposure. Degree of impairment. Lost earning capacity. The amounts were small. A few £100. Sometimes a few thousand. For lungs that would never heal. For decades of breathing dust. For lives shortened by years. The workers accepted the payments. They had no choice. The money was something. It was more than nothing. It was less than justice. The workers died quietly. They died in the 1980s. They died in the 1990s. They died in care homes. They died in hospitals. They died struggling for breath. Their deaths were recorded as respiratory failure, as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, as complications of pneumonia. The cause was listed as natural. The cotton dust was not mentioned. The mills were not mentioned. The connection was invisible in the records. The workers simply died old, died sick, died poor. Their children remember them coughing, always coughing. The sound of it in the morning, the sound of it at night. The handkerchief pressed to the mouth, the struggle to breathe after climbing stairs. The oxygen tank in later years, the thin frame, the exhaustion, the quiet acceptance. Their children did not work in the mills. The mills were closed by then. The children found other work. They worked in offices. They worked in shops. They worked in call centers. They breathed clean air. They did not develop the cough. They lived longer. They remembered their parents differently. Not as workers. Not as victims. Just as people who had been tired. Who had always been tired. The mill buildings decayed. The roofs collapsed. The walls crumbled. The floors rotted. Nature entered. Weeds grew through the floorboards. Birds nested in the rafters. Rain fell through broken windows. The dust settled finally. It settled permanently. It mixed with soil. It became invisible. The buildings were demolished eventually. Some in the 2000s. Some more recently. The bricks were salvaged. The land was cleared. Housing developments were built. Retail parks were built. The new structures had no memory, no plaques, no markers, just new buildings on old ground. The people who live there now do not know. They do not know what stood there. They do not know who worked there. They do not know about the dust. The history is not taught locally. It is not part of the curriculum. It is mentioned briefly. Industrial revolution. Cotton production, economic growth. Then the lesson moves forward. A few museums remain, small local museums. They display photographs, black and white images, workers standing in rows, women at spinning frames, children beneath machines. The photographs are faded, the faces are unclear, the names are mostly unknown. A few artifacts remain. A bobbin, a shuttle, a piece of machinery. They sit behind glass. They are labeled. They are preserved. They are not understood. Visitors look briefly. They read the placard. They move to the next exhibit. The experience is abstract. The dust is not visible. The cough is not audible. The suffering is not present. Just objects. Just history. Just something that happened before. The last workers are gone now. The last person who breathed that air, who tied those threads, who heard that noise. They died in the early 2000s. They died unremarked. Their obituaries mentioned family. They mentioned hobbies. They mentioned kindness. They did not mention the mill. The mill was just where they worked. It was not considered significant, not worth recording, not worth remembering. The process did not end suddenly. It thinned. It slowed. The machines stopped running. The workers stopped entering. The dust stopped rising. What remained was not collapse, but fading. Not dramatic closure, just gradual emptiness. Buildings that stood, then crumbled, then vanished. Lives that were spent, then ended, then forgotten. The cotton is still processed now. It is processed elsewhere, in Bangladesh, in Vietnam, in countries where labor is cheaper. The workers there breathe dust. They develop coughs. They work 12-hour shifts. The windows are closed. The pattern continues, just elsewhere, just out of sight. The system did not end. It moved. Here, the buildings are gone. The workers are gone. The dust has settled into earth. What remains is silence, and empty land, and a history that is not quite remembered, not quite forgotten, just absent, quiet, still. At the start of the 1800s, London's streets were dark after sunset. The darkness was complete in winter when the sun set before 5 o'clock in the afternoon. People carried lanterns if they could afford them or walked close to buildings to avoid the center of the street. Crime occurred frequently in the darkness and accidents were common where carriages moved without light. The city needed illumination and gas provided it more efficiently than oil or candle flame. Gas was produced from coal heated in large retorts at gasworks built along the Thames and other rivers. The coal was heated until it released flammable vapors which were captured and pressurized into iron pipes. The pipes ran beneath the streets, branching into smaller pipes that fed individual lamps mounted on posts. By the 1830s, thousands of gas lamps stood along major thoroughfares, and by the 1850s they numbered in the tens of thousands. Each lamp required daily attention because each lamp had to be lit manually at dusk and extinguished manually at dawn. This work was performed by lamplighters who were employed by the gas companies or by local parish councils. The lamplighters were usually men, though occasionally women performed the work in smaller districts or during wartime labor shortages. They were paid modest weekly wages and provided with a ladder and a lighting pole, which was a long wooden staff with a small hook at the end. The lamplighters worked alone, walking fixed routes that covered several miles and included hundreds of individual lamps. The routes were assigned and the lamplighter walked the same route every evening and every morning without variation. The work began in late afternoon during winter and later during summer, following a schedule that adjusted with the changing sunset times. The lamplighter left his home or the depot carrying his ladder over one shoulder and his lighting pole in the other hand. He wore working clothes that were durable and a cap to keep rain from his face, though no uniform was required in most districts. He walked to the first lamp on his route, which might be half a mile from where he started depending on the district. The lamp stood on an iron post about 10 feet high with a glass enclosure at the top protecting the gas mantle from wind. The lamplighter approached the post and positioned his ladder against it, checking that the base was stable on the cobblestones. He climbed the ladder holding the lighting pole and reaching upward toward the lamp's small access door, which opened with a latch. He hooked the latch with the end of his pole and pulled the door open, revealing the gas valve and the pilot light mechanism. If the lamp used a pilot light, it remained burning faintly throughout the day, and the lamplighter simply turned the main valve to increase the gas flow. The increased gas ignited from the pilot, and the lamp brightened to full illumination, casting yellow light across the street below. If the lamp had no pilot light, the lamplighter carried a small ignition device or a burning taper which he held to the gas jet as he opened the valve. The gas ignited with a soft sound and the light spread outward through the glass enclosure, creating a pool of visibility on the pavement. The lamplighter closed the access door, descended the ladder, lifted it from the post and walked to the next lamp. The next lamp might be 50 feet away or it might be 200 feet, depending on the street's importance and width. He repeated the process at each lamp, moving steadily along his route without pause except to reposition the ladder or avoid passing traffic. The work required no particular skill beyond the ability to climb safely and manage the pole with sufficient dexterity to operate the small latches. It required punctuality because the lamps needed to be lit before full darkness arrived, and the gas company monitored this through occasional inspections. It required endurance because the route was long and the lamplighter walked it entirely on foot, carrying the ladder which weighed perhaps 15 pounds. In winter the lamplighter worked in cold and often in rain, which made the cobblestones slippery and the ladder difficult to stabilize. The rain soaked through his clothing because waterproof garments were expensive and not provided by most employers at that time. His hands became cold and stiff, which made gripping the pole more difficult and operating the small latches slower and more awkward. The wind blew out the taper if he was using one, which required him to relight it multiple times during the route. The darkness arrived quickly in winter, and if the lamplighter fell behind schedule, he worked in near total darkness himself, relying on familiarity with the route. He knew the streets by memory after walking them daily for months or years, and could locate each lamp post by counting steps and recognizing landmarks. The route took approximately 2 to 3 hours to complete, depending on the number of lamps and the distance between them. A lamplighter responsible for 300 lamps might finish by 8 o'clock, while one responsible for 500 might work until 9 or later. After lighting the final lamp, the lamplighter returned home carrying his ladder and pole and rested until the early morning, when the work resumed. The morning shift began before dawn, when the lamplighter returned to the same route and extinguished each lamp in reverse order. He climbed the ladder, opened the access door and turned the gas valve to close the flow, which extinguished the flame immediately. The lamp darkened and the street returned to the growing natural light of dawn, which was sufficient by the time the lamplighter finished his route. The morning work was faster than the evening because extinguishing required only closing the valve with no need for ignition or careful flame management. The lamplighter finished the morning route and returned home or proceeded to other work if he held a secondary job during daylight hours. Many lamplighters worked additional jobs because the wages from lighting alone were insufficient to support a family adequately. They worked as laborers or deliverymen or street sweepers, filling the hours between the morning and evening lamp rounds with other physical tasks. The gas lamps themselves required maintenance beyond the daily lighting, and this work was performed by separate crews employed by the gas companies. The glass enclosures cracked from temperature changes or from stones thrown by children and needed replacement several times each year. The mantles wore out from constant heating and needed replacement monthly, or the light dimmed noticeably and complaints were made by residents. The iron posts rusted from exposure to rain and required repainting periodically, though this was done infrequently, and many posts showed extensive corrosion. The gas pipes occasionally leaked at the joints where they connected to the lamp posts, and the leaks created a distinct smell that passers-by noticed. Leaks were dangerous because escaping gas could ignite from the lamp's own flame or from a spark and cause an explosion that shattered the glass and sometimes injured people nearby. The gas companies employed inspectors who walked the routes during daylight, checking for leaks and damaged equipment and noting which lamps required repair. The lamplighters reported problems they noticed during their rounds but were not responsible for repairs and simply continued their lighting schedule around broken lamps. A broken lamp remained unlit until the repair crew arrived, which might be days or weeks later depending on the severity and the company's resources. The streets with unlit lamps returned to darkness in those sections, and people avoided them or walked more cautiously through the unilluminated areas. The lamplighters worked through all weather, including heavy fog, which was common in London and reduced visibility to a few feet in some areas. The fog made locating the lamp posts difficult even for experienced lamplighters who knew their routes, and they sometimes walked past a lamp without seeing it. They retraced their steps when they realized the error and lit the mist lamp before continuing, though this added time to an already long shift. The fog also made the ladder unstable because the cobblestones became slick with moisture and the ladder's feet slipped more easily when weight was applied. Lamplighters fell occasionally from the ladders, landing on the hard street surface and suffering broken bones or head injuries that prevented them from working. There was no compensation for injuries beyond what the employer chose to provide voluntarily, which was often nothing or a small payment for immediate medical costs. The injured lamplighter recovered at home without income, or he did not recover and was replaced by another worker who needed the position. The gas companies did not lack applicants because the work required no education and no specialized training, and many men needed employment. The turnover was high, particularly among younger workers who found the routine monotonous and the wages inadequate and left for other opportunities when available. Older workers remained longer because they had fewer alternatives, and the work, though tedious, was less physically demanding than factory labor or construction. The lamplighters developed a routine that became automatic after sufficient repetition, and they performed the work without conscious thought, walking and climbing and lighting in a pattern that required no mental effort. This automaticity made the work bearable because it allowed the mind to wander while the body continued the familiar motions without active direction. Some lamplighters sang quietly to themselves or recited memorized verses or thought about personal matters while their hands operated the pole and their feet climbed the ladder. The work was solitary with no interaction with other workers except occasionally passing another lamplighter on an adjacent route at the boundary between districts. They might nod in acknowledgement or exchange brief words about the weather or a broken lamp, but generally continued without stopping because the schedule allowed no time for conversation. The lamplighters were visible figures in the evening cityscape, moving along the streets with their ladders and creating light in their wake as they progressed. Children sometimes followed them for a short distance, watching the lamps ignite and asking questions, which the lamplighters answered briefly if they were inclined to speak. Most lamplighters did not encourage conversation because it slowed their work, and because they had answered the same questions countless times from countless children over the years. The public regarded lamplighters as necessary but unremarkable workers performing a service that was expected and not particularly valued until a lamp remained unlit and the darkness was noticed. Complaints were directed to the gas company when lamps failed to light on schedule, and the company reprimanded the lamplighter or dismissed him if complaints were frequent. The pressure to maintain punctuality was constant, and the lamplighters walked quickly even when tired or unwell because falling behind meant criticism and possible job loss. The work continued year after year with the same routes walked at the same times by the same individuals or by their replacements when death or dismissal created vacancies. The lamplighters aged while performing the work, and their bodies wore down from the repetitive climbing and the long distances walked daily in all weather conditions. Their knees deteriorated from climbing ladders thousands of times each year, and their backs ached from carrying the ladder's weight over miles of walking. Their hands developed calluses from gripping the wooden pole, and their fingers stiffened from arthritis aggravated by cold, wet weather and constant use. By the time a lamplighter reached his 50s or 60s, he often could no longer perform the work adequately and was dismissed without pension or support. He had no savings because the wages had never allowed for savings, and he faced poverty in old age with a body too damaged for other physical labor. Some former lamplighters ended in workhouses or relied on family members or died quietly in cheap lodgings without record or notice. The system did not account for these outcomes because the system required only that the lamps be lit and extinguished daily, and this requirement was met. The technology remained unchanged for decades because gaslighting functioned adequately and no compelling reason existed to modify the system significantly. The lamps burned with consistent brightness when maintained properly, and the fuel supply was reliable as long as the gasworks continued operating without interruption. Improvements occurred gradually in the design of mantles, which became more efficient and produced brighter light from the same gas consumption levels. The Wellspot mantle was introduced in the 1880s, and it glowed more intensely than earlier designs because it used rare earth elements in its construction. Gas companies adopted the new mantles slowly because they cost more than the old mantles, and the increased brightness was not considered essential for street lighting. Some districts installed the improved mantles while others continued using older designs for years until the old stock was depleted and replacement became necessary. The lamplighters noticed little difference in their work because the mantles still required the same lighting procedure and the same daily attention regardless of design. The number of gas lamps increased as London expanded outward and new streets were built in areas that had previously been fields or empty land. Each new street required lamp posts spaced at intervals determined by municipal regulations, and each new lamp required a lamplighter to service it daily. The gas companies hired additional lamplighters to cover the expanding routes, though they preferred to extend existing routes rather than create entirely new positions. A lamplighter's route grew longer over time as new lamps were added to his territory, and his working hours increased accordingly without corresponding wage increases. The lamplighters accepted these changes because refusal meant dismissal and replacement by someone willing to work the extended hours for the same pay. The work week was 6 days with Sunday reserved for rest, though some routes required Sunday lighting during winter when darkness fell early enough to necessitate illumination. The lamplighters who worked Sundays received no additional compensation because the work was considered part of their standard duties, and Sunday rates did not apply to this employment. Religious observance was common among working people, but the lamplighters had no choice except to work when scheduled or lose their positions entirely. They attended church services when their work schedule permitted, or they did not attend and accepted this as a consequence of their employment situation. The social status of lamplighters was low within the working class hierarchy because the work required no skill and commanded minimal respect from others. They ranked below skilled tradesmen and factory workers, and slightly above general laborers and crossing sweepers in the informal social structure of labor. Their children attended school irregularly, if at all, because education was not compulsory until later in the century, and families needed children's earnings to supplement household income. The children of lamplighters often became lamplighters themselves or entered similar unskilled positions because they lacked education and connections to access better opportunities. This pattern repeated across generations, with families remaining in the same economic position decade after decade without upward movement or significant change. The lamplighters lived in working-class neighborhoods in terraced houses or tenement buildings where multiple families shared facilities and space was limited. The houses were poorly ventilated and damp, with mold growing on walls and respiratory illness common among residents who breathed the stale air continuously. The lamplighters returned home after their evening rounds smelling of gas and coal smoke which permeated their clothing and could not be fully removed by washing. Their wives washed the clothing weekly in cold water using harsh soap that damaged the fabric over time, making it thin and easily torn. The clothing wore out quickly from constant use and exposure to weather and had to be replaced frequently, though money for replacement was scarce. The lamplighters owned few possessions beyond essential clothing and basic furniture and had no decorative items or luxuries of any kind in their homes. Meals consisted of bread and potatoes primarily, with occasional meat when affordable, though meat was expensive and reserved for special occasions or Sundays. The diet was nutritionally inadequate and the lamplighters were often thin and suffered from deficiencies that caused fatigue and weakness, though they continued working regardless. Their health declined gradually over years of poor nutrition and constant physical strain, and they developed chronic conditions that were never treated by doctors. Doctors were too expensive for working people, and the lamplighters relied on home remedies or simply endured illness until it passed or worsened to the point of death. Infant mortality was high in working-class families, and the lamplighters buried children who died from disease or malnutrition or accidents in overcrowded tenement buildings. The deaths were common enough that they were accepted as unfortunate but normal occurrences, and families continued despite the losses because they had no alternative. The lamplighters had no pension system and no expectation of retirement, and they worked until their bodies failed completely and then stopped working and died shortly after. The transition from employment to death was often brief because once unable to work they had no income and no means to support themselves adequately. They relied on charity or family support if available, or entered the workhouse where conditions were deliberately harsh to discourage dependence on public assistance. The workhouse separated families and imposed labor requirements on inmates who were capable of working and provided minimal food and shelter in exchange. Former lamplighters who entered the workhouse rarely left alive and died there after months or years of institutional routine in crowded wards with inadequate heating. Their deaths were recorded in workhouse registers with brief notations of age and cause, but no detail about their previous lives or the work they had performed. The system absorbed them and discarded them and replaced them without pause or acknowledgement of their individual existence or contribution to the functioning city. Meanwhile, the gas companies profited substantially from the lighting contracts and expanded their operations into domestic gas supply for cooking and heating in welfare households. The companies were privately owned and operated for profit, and shareholders received dividends while workers received wages that remained stagnant despite increasing company revenues. Attempts to organize labor unions among lamplighters were unsuccessful because the workers were scattered across different employers and different districts with no central workplace. They worked alone and had little opportunity to meet collectively or discuss grievances or coordinate action against employers who controlled their livelihoods completely. Individual complaints were ignored or met with dismissal, and the threat of dismissal was sufficient to prevent most workers from raising concerns about wages or conditions. The gas companies maintained detailed records of lighting times and inspector reports, but kept no records of worker injuries or illnesses or deaths related to employment. The absence of records made the human cost of the system invisible in official accounts, which focused on expansion and efficiency and technological progress. The lamplighters appeared in census records as heads of household with occupations listed simply as lamplighter and no additional information about their circumstances. They appeared in parish registers when they married or when their children were baptized or when they died and were buried in common graves. Beyond these minimal official traces, they left almost no documentary evidence of their lives or their experiences or their feelings about the work they performed daily. Occasionally a lamplighter appeared in court records charged with drunkenness or petty theft or failure to light lamps on schedule according to company complaints. The court proceedings were brief and the punishments were fines the lamplighters could not afford or short jail sentences that resulted in job loss upon release. The criminal justice system treated them harshly because they were poor and had no influence and no ability to defend themselves effectively against charges. A few lamplighters were mentioned in newspaper articles when they died in unusual circumstances, such as falling from ladders during storms or being struck by carriages while working. The articles described the incidents briefly without much detail and expressed no particular sympathy or outrage, but simply reported the facts as minor local news items. The lamplighters were not considered newsworthy except when their deaths involved unusual circumstances that briefly captured public attention before being forgotten. Some social reformers documented working conditions in London during the mid to late Victorian period and included brief descriptions of lamplighters among other labouring occupations. The descriptions noted the long hours and low wages and the physical demands, but offered little analysis or advocacy for improvement beyond general calls for reform. The reformers focused more attention on factory workers and child labour in mines because these issues generated stronger public reaction and political support for legislative change. Lamplighters were mentioned peripherally as examples of urban labour but were not central to reform movements and benefited little from progressive legislation when it eventually passed. Regulations requiring safety equipment or limiting working hours applied primarily to factory employment and did not extend to outdoor workers like lamplighters, who remained largely unregulated. The gas companies continued operating under their existing practices without significant interference from government authorities who had limited enforcement capacity and limited interest in minor occupational issues. The lamplighters continued their routines, walking the same streets, lighting the same lamps year after year while the city changed around them gradually. New buildings rose where old ones had stood, and streets were widened and paved with asphalt instead of cobblestones, making walking easier but changing nothing else substantially. The population increased and traffic increased and the pace of urban life accelerated, but the lamplighters maintained their steady walking rhythm unaffected by surrounding changes. They represented continuity in a changing environment, performing a task that remained constant even as other aspects of city life transformed rapidly during industrialization. The constancy was not comforting but simply repetitive, and the lamplighters experienced their work as unchanging routine rather than stable employment or reliable security. Each day was identical to the previous day, and each season repeated the patterns of the previous season, and each year blurred into the next without distinction. The monotony was oppressive, and some lamplighters drank heavily to escape the tedium, though alcohol was expensive and drinking reduced their already inadequate income further. Public houses served working men in the evenings, and lamplighters sometimes stopped after completing their rounds to spend a portion of their wages on beer or gin. The drinking provided temporary relief from physical discomfort and mental boredom, but led to health problems and family conflict and worsened their overall circumstances. Wives complained about money spent on drink instead of food, and arguments occurred frequently in households where resources were desperately scarce and every penny mattered. The lamplighters had few other outlets for recreation or relaxation because they lacked time and money for entertainment and were too exhausted after work for activities requiring energy. They slept poorly in crowded, uncomfortable homes and woke tired to begin the cycle again, walking through dark streets with their ladders and poles. The work damaged them slowly through accumulated physical strain and inadequate rest and poor nutrition and constant exposure to cold and wet conditions. By middle age, most lamplighters showed visible signs of premature aging, with stooped postures and stiff movements and chronic coughing from respiratory ailments. They looked older than their actual years and were often mistaken for men a decade or more senior because hard labor and poverty aged bodies rapidly. Their contemporaries who worked indoor jobs or who had better nutrition aged less visibly, though poverty affected everyone in the working class to varying degrees. The lamplighters were among the poorest of the employed working class because their wages were below average and their work offered no advancement opportunities whatsoever. They remained lamplighters until they could no longer perform the work, and then they stopped and had nothing and died in obscurity and poverty.